Then another sign appeared in heaven. There was a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 crowns. And his tail swept away a third of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. And the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she did give birth, he might devour her child. Hey guys, it's good to see you. Get rid of these glasses and get rid of the glare off my glasses. It's good to see you today, and I hope you guys are all well as we're looking at this final lecture video for the semester. It's our last day of class is actually Thursday of next week, April the 23rd. So we hope that you're all staying well and that things are going okay with your family during this time of just trying to stay at home and stay away from other people and all the things we can do to avoid catching COVID-19. I'm sure many of you probably know someone or know or at least family members or friends who have been affected by the virus, and we hope that you are doing all you can to keep yourself well as we try to finish out the semester on a high note. So as you could see from the beginning and the reading, we're looking at the book of Revelation this week. I usually save the book of Revelation for the last week just because it's probably one of the most difficult to interpret, but also at the same time it requires a little bit more of you to sort of think through some things. So as you're looking at that picture of the dragon that I started with, here it is again, just in case you weren't paying attention. So what does all this stuff mean in the book of Revelation when it's talking about beasts and dragons and all of these different types of things and all the different things that you're going to be looking at this week? You're actually going to be reading 2 separate units, quote unquote, in the book of Revelation. But before that, you have some articles to read, which are already posted, and we're actually going to talk about one of those here in just a moment. So looking at the book of Revelation, then, what we're basically talking about with regard to our critical thinking process is the understanding of that we're using a very specific type of language, and that language is known as apocalyptic language. Now, most of you have heard the term apocalypse as it quote unquote sort of applies to the end of the world, the apocalypse, so to speak. But apocalyptic language is its own critter unto itself. So even whether or not you're talking about the end of the world or not, there's lots of places where the language can be apocalyptic language without it necessarily referring to the end of the world. So we want to take some time this week and look at some of this language and see how it works and see how it affects and it wraps itself around it. And in that, then, after we sort of talk about some of the language, then we're going to talk about Revelation per se and look at some of the passages in there. Now, the first thing that I want us to look at, and your first assignment that you're doing this week, is reading an article in the ebook, in the Reader, called How to Interpret Bible Prophecy by Mark Biddle. It's only a couple of pages, but it's a very important article because it draws something to our attention that we need before we delve into the book of Revelation. Understand Revelation has a very complicated history of interpretation, and so we want to kind of prepare ourselves before we start reading there. But Biddle's main point is the idea of, he opens the article saying, when the events are in the Persian Gulf during the first Gulf War, which was back in the very early 90s, before most of you were even born. He said he received phone calls from a local newspaper who were calling sort of the Baptist Old Testament professor who they wanted to know, is this fulfillment of Bible prophecy? And he says no. And most people would kind of scratch their head and go, well, but wait a minute, isn't that what Bible prophecy is all about? But Biddle points out in the article the whole idea about the fact that there are events in the biblical record that were quote unquote viewed as prophetic that have already been fulfilled, and they're no longer prophecies, but they are example and they're lessons for us to learn from. And he makes mention of several in the book of Jeremiah, as well as in the book of Isaiah, and also in the book of Psalms. So we need to understand, when we come to start talking about apocalyptic language, we start dealing with a lot of people's attitudes toward the idea of prophecy and so on. Now, we'll look at sort of what that means just a little bit. But the whole idea that we want to keep in mind is the fact that understand that a lot of the things that are recorded in scriptures that come across as prophetic are intended to teach us lessons, not necessarily give us a roadmap to the future. Okay, now that's one way of seeing that. So we want to make sure that we underscore that. That's one way of seeing things. So what I want to talk about then is this idea of this language, this type of language. We've looked at a lot of different things this semester. We've looked at things that were narratives that told us stories, like the birth of Jesus that we did just a few weeks ago, or last week during Easter week, in which you looked at the different accounts of the crucifixion. And I hope that and I noticed as you were doing your notes on that, how many of you really picked up on the very slight differences between the four Gospels when it comes to telling that story. There are striking differences, and those differences are important. And so it's interesting to see how you read them all and then sort of picked your way through to pull out those details. And then, of course, the 7 sayings from the cross, that was a law, but that was a softball for you to hit out of the park, and everybody did a really good job on that. But those are important. All types of services and administrations in the Mass for the Catholic Church, and honestly, a lot of very important things in Protestant Church as well, that dealing with those sayings from the cross. So these last couple of weeks, then, you've been looking at some very important, huge ideas of what's taken place in the biblical record as far as how it affects Christianity and where Christianity comes from, and so on. But this language that we're talking about this week is a little different. We didn't really poetry this semester. We didn't do a lot of poetry, although we could have. There were things that we read that sort of felt poetic. As you looked at the law a couple of weeks ago, and you read all the laws about how God came down on the mountain and delivered the law, thou shalt not, all those things that sort of, those repeated stanzas that present themselves as poetry. But apocalyptic language is not poetry, but it's also not narrative per se. It's not that it's necessarily trying to tell us a specific story. So if we think about it, then let's just start with the word itself, the word apocalypse. In the Bible, there is a single book that is known as an apocalypse, and that's the book of Revelation, which of course is the last book in the New Testament. Being an apocalypse, the word apocalypse means to tear the roof off. If you actually read it in Greek, it means to remove the roof and look down. If you've ever seen pictures, just actually this week, from folks whose homes were damaged by tornadoes and such from the rough weather that came through the other day, as the helicopters flew over and gave you aerial footage of the devastation, you could actually see where the walls are still standing, but you could look down inside the walls and see the inside of the house. That's the idea what the word apocalypse actually means. It means a glimpse inside. So the apocalypse itself is not necessarily about telling us specifically, but it's about giving us a glimpse of things behind the scenes. There's always this idea in apocalyptic language about things that are hidden, okay? So this idea then of revealing what's hidden. Now, so what does that mean then? Well, when we come to look at the world around us and we look at the way that things are, and I don't know about your experience, depending upon where you live, if you've seen the streets of some of the major cities as they've been shut down these last few days, it's been striking to see places like New York City and Paris and London and all these great bustling metropolises that have had nobody out on the streets, even like on a Sunday morning, when there's just the streets are empty. It really does have sort of this post-apocalyptic feel to it, like we see in a lot of movies. If you like to watch horror movies, it's particularly zombie movies, and so there's always that kind of feeling. It's like everything's quiet. Everything's just shut down, and it's bizarre, and it feels completely weird. I don't know about you, that's sort of been my experience these last few weeks. It's just a really, really weird time. It feels really strange. It feels apocalyptic, like it's the end of the world. So the purpose then of apocalypse is to reveal things that are hidden. Okay, now, if we wanted to talk about social locations, quote unquote, different groups that have read this in different ways, there's lots of different social locations to read the book of Revelation from. So some of the things that you'll see, there are political messages in the book of Revelation. There are also social messages in the book of Revelation. There are lots and lots and lots of symbols and metaphors. There are lots of numbers. There are lots of natural events as well as supernatural events. There are spiritual connotations as well as very physical, natural world kind of connotations as well. The language itself can be extraordinarily difficult because it's written in code. Now, when I say that, don't run out and buy those books that talk about the Bible codes and all that kind of stuff. Biddle addresses that in his article. That's not the way we're looking at the Bible at all. The Bible is written for people to read and for people to understand. There are veiled metaphors, yes, and veiled symbols. But understand, the audience that this letter is written to initially, that the book of Revelation is written to initially, they didn't need somebody to break the code for them. They knew what the author was talking about. So when we say the language is coded, C-O-D-E-D, and when it's written in sort of a code, understand, if you've got the key to the code, if you know what the author's talking about, then basically what you're getting is you're getting a letter written to you that's talking about things that you completely and fully understand, and there's nothing to figure out, and the things that you're reading are horrible. Okay, but because you know the answers, you know what's going on behind the scenes. A lot of the things that were written at the time to veil and protect those who would read and to protect the author as well. So when you see this language, it seems like it's so symbolic and it's so weighed down with metaphor and so on. Understand that you're talking about and looking at something that was written to a very specific audience. So big ideas, big ideas. The book of Revelation is a book about persecution. It's a book about persecution of the faithful by forces, political forces, supernatural forces, and so on that are greatly, greatly, greatly hostile and antagonistic toward them and their particular faith. In other words, it's written to Christians about Christians being persecuted. That's the basis for the book of Revelation. But and despite all the disasters, and there are a number of them, and you will read about those, despite the disasters and the horrible things and the judgments of God that are being poured forth on the earth, understand that the whole letter is a demonstration of God's intervention on behalf of the faithful. There are those who remain faithful throughout the punishments and throughout the executions and throughout the disasters. It's about sort of a phrase that gets used in the Old Testament. The idea of people taking vengeance, quote unquote, for things that have been done against them is ruled out, and God says, "Vengeance is mine." The book of Revelation is about that vengeance, God's vengeance being finally poured out on the earth. It's horrific at its least. So it deals with the ultimate ideas. And we've read some things that sort of deal with ultimate ideas. When we talked about, when Jesus was talking about the law, when we talked about in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus talked about the law, you've heard it said, "Don't commit adultery." Jesus says, "I say to you, don't even be angry." Jesus, you've heard it said, "Don't commit murder." Jesus says, "Don't commit murder." Jesus says, "Don't even be angry." Don't commit adultery. Jesus says, "Don't even look with lust in your heart," and so on. These sort of bigger ideas than what's written in a physical sense. So we're dealing with a book that's dealing with ultimate questions. So there's a lot of good versus evil, right? And if we really wanted to sort of get into some of that, we could actually look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are not part of the Bible, of course, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in their literature, they have a lot of apocalyptic literature dealing with the battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness and so on. It's very exciting stuff. The book of Daniel also has some very apocalyptic passages as well, and there's some in the Gospels too. We didn't read those particular ones. So this idea of how this language operates, it's about good and evil. It's about reward and punishment. It's about being ultimately with God or being ultimately punished and removed from God's presence. It's about entering into eternal bliss and into heaven, or it's about being sent out into eternal punishment, and so on. So you get these ultimate ideas, the ultimate destinies of the earth, and the ultimate destiny of human beings, and what God's plan actually is overall, and so on. So when we get this. So how do we deal with this? Sometimes I refer to it as its own beast altogether, the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation has its own very long history of being a very difficult book. The book of Revelation was one of the last books that was viewed and accepted as canonical in the New Testament. In fact, there were some folks who actually wanted to not include it because of how easy it is to misunderstand it. But through the use of the book by the churches very early on, and how widespread it was. Of course, it's very popular even today. There are people all over the world who read the book of Revelation, even if they're not Christians or have never read the Bible before, because they get interested because of events going on in the world. So we'd have to look at sort of how the book of Revelation got included into the Bible, but that's not as important as viewing the fact that it did get put in there. It is attributed to John the Apostle. There are some who want to argue and say it was John the Elder, who was a next generation person, but the author is not so much a concern for us as the content. Now, these ideas. So one primary idea, even if we're just looking at numbers, the idea of numbers. Okay, we don't think of numbers in the terms of how people did in biblical times. Numbers in biblical times had meanings. It wasn't just about the fact that you lived at such and such a street and such and such a number and so on, or that date was a certain number and so on. It goes beyond that. That they lived in a metaphorical world in which numbers were seen as metaphors. Now, one of the most striking numbers, of course, in the book of Revelation is at the tail end of chapter 13, which you will be reading. Here is wisdom. The one who has understanding must calculate the number of the beast. That is the number of a man. His number is 666. We don't think in those terms. We don't understand what does that mean. What does that mean? It's the number of a person, and his number is 666. We don't think in those terms. There's an avalanche of ideas here. You'll find in the book of Revelation, the use of numbers is excruciating. There are so many numbers. Just in the first couple of chapters, I'm not having you read all of them, but in the first couple of chapters, the number 7. There are 7 letters, 7 angels, 7 spirits, 7 lampstands, 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls or 7 plagues that are poured out upon the earth. Why so many sevens? 7 in biblical sense is the number for God. The number for God represents completion. That's why there are quote unquote 7 days in creation, and so on and so on. Okay, so this whole idea of 7 is about these early sevens are all about these are expressions of divinity. They're expressions of what God is doing and how God is doing it, and so on. Which is why the number 666 actually sort of falls in and says, oh, wait a minute, that's 6 is the number of man. 6 is seen as one step short of God, so therefore it's incomplete. So a triple 6 is a full-blown incompletion. It's a full-blown man idea, not God idea. Okay, so that's just a single example, and I probably didn't give as much depth to as it needs, but that whole idea, the fact that numbers have meanings. Now, these numbers also very early on in the passages that you're going to be reading in chapters 6, 8, and 9, I believe, there are numbers inside of numbers. So you have the 7 seals, and then you have the 7 trumpets, and then you have the 7 bowls, but actually the last trumpet is this, and the last bowl is that. So it's instead of being stretched out in a straight line, it's layer upon layer upon layer upon layer upon layer in some places, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to interpret. So in dealing with this thing, then we have to sort of understand. Just coming into it, you're looking at just the language itself. Even if you just try to read it as a narrative, it's extraordinarily complex. Now, historically, and we always want to try and place a book historically so that we know what's going on in the world. Those of you who are familiar with your Roman history, which is probably not many of you, to be honest, we don't study Roman history the way we used to years and years ago. To put ourselves in the terms of Roman history, if we look at when the book of Revelation is composed, the book of Revelation is composed about the same time as the book of John, and somewhere, according to all scholarly opinions, somewhere in the early 90s, AD. So if you're talking about Jesus being born, 1 BC, dying in 33 AD, and resurrected according to what we read in the Gospels, then you're looking at the Acts of the Apostles, which stretches over into the early 60s, and then the rest of the Bible, the rest of the New Testament falls in and comes around, and so that you kind of wrap up with the book of the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation sort of being the last ones composed in the early 90s, 90 to 94, let's just say that. Now, so to ground us then with what's going on in the Roman world, the person that we need to look at particularly would be the Emperor Domitian. Domitian was qualified and described as uh, as the beast from hell, licking blood, lying in its den. That's how some of the people who knew him described him. Okay, but the difficulty was this: Domitian went one step further than some of the earlier emperors had done, and Domitian instituted emperor worship. In other words, the imperial cult, as it's called, that to be a good Roman citizen and to be a good citizen of the empire was that you participated in the cult of the empire. And the cult of the empire for Domitian was that you looked at him and praised him and worshiped him as God. Now, so here you get this idea, right? Instead of worshiping the true God of the Hebrews that we've read about so much about in the scriptures, we're worshiping Domitian, who is the Roman emperor. So a man exalting himself as God is sort of the underlying idea here. Now, Domitian reigned from 81 to 96 AD. And so the title that he gave himself was Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, is how he describes himself. So understand then, if you're a Christian or a Jew during this time period, you are in the bullseye, because both Jews and Christians both refused to worship Domitian as God. There's just no way that was going to happen. So persecution, a man exalting himself as God to be worshipped, great persecution and bloodshed being poured out, lots and lots of people killed during Domitian's reign. Lots of persecution of religious groups, particularly Jews and Christians, and others along the way, because they refused to bow, and so on. So that sort of gives us at least a historical glimpse, a snapshot as to sort of where we are when we're in this particular time period, and where and how the book of Revelation is generated. Now think about how many people are dying as martyrs, how many people are dying for the faith, how many people are being arrested and killed by the Romans for not participating in the imperial cult, and so on. And then you begin to understand some of the images inside the book of Revelation, particularly when it comes to acts of vengeance being poured out upon the earth by God. Now, all right, so we've got the historical glimpse right there. So if we wanted to look at social location, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, we would be talking about a late first century Roman idea that we would have to get a hold of and look at that context to fully understand what's going on in that particular place. Okay? Now, but the Roman Empire doesn't last forever. By about 400 AD, the Roman Empire had begun to collapse, and all different kinds of things had happened, and so on. So then we're looking at a further 1800 years of interpretation. So here's where, for us modern readers, or I should say postmodern readers, it's kind of where we are these days. For us postmodern readers, where we fall into the mix is we have a long history of interpretation. Okay, and that long history of interpretation. Sorry about that. That long history of interpretation puts us and gives us some certain ideas that we need to get a hold of. Hold on just a minute. I'm going to create a list so that you can see it. Okay. Okay. So here we go. Get situated here. There are 4 main schools of interpretation when it comes to reading the book of Revelation. Now, understand that the book of Revelation has a long, colorful history of all different types of interpretation. Some fabulous, really interesting things are in the early church fathers, written from about 100 AD to about 800 AD. Just really interesting things. And so you can spend a long time researching these. But I kind of want to just sort of break down the four basic trains of thought, so to speak, with regard to this book. There's actually it's actually a really great book. Let me see if it's on my bookshelf. Okay, cool. A really good book that if you really wanted to check out all of these out, and all these are in this book, is this. It's called Revelation, Four Views, a Parallel Commentary. So if you ever want to actually get a really good glimpse of all four of these, what's really cool with this is that they're printed out, all four views, if I can find a good spot here, are in columns. So as the columns, you can look at each one, column by column by column, place by place by place, verse by verse by verse. It's a really interesting book. I did a study on Wednesday nights some years ago at a church I was serving on Wednesday night for the book of Revelation, and it took us almost 18 months to get through. So it was a long process. So anyway, we'll break these down for you. Four basic schools. The first one is, sorry, my image is reversed. There, first one here, preterist. Preterist is based in the word itself is based in a French word, which means already, okay? Now, already, so the preterist view is this, that when you read the book of Revelation, that it was, quote unquote, prophetic in the hand of the author. It was prophetic at the time that it was written, quote unquote, just like Jeremiah and Isaiah and so on were prophetic at the time of their writing, their composition. But the preterist school believes that the overwhelming largest percentage of the book of Revelation has already been completed, thus the term already, preterist, okay? It's already done. So that most of it, if not indeed practically all of it, was all about the Roman Empire. So that when it was written, it was about the Romans primarily and the Christians who were suffering underneath Roman rule. And even those that sort of saw it as prophetic, even in the handwriting of John, who died before all of it took place, before the Roman Empire wraps up, really most of the book of Revelation has taken place during that particular time period. So basically, with the book of with the preterist view, the book of Revelation is a closed book. It's all already happened, except for the things at the very, 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 very end of the book, which of course deals with the coming of heaven and the new city and so on, descending from heaven, and basically the end of all things. That basically all of it's happened except that. So the preterist view is one that is held by a lot of scholars and interpreters who really are sort of looking at and will try to ground the events in the book of Revelation in the Roman Empire. Now, the second one is known as the historicist view. The historicist view. Now, the historicist is not entirely different from the preterist. The historicist basically says that yes, it was about the Romans at that particular time. It was about the Roman Empire, but not everything in it is about the Roman Empire. And there were things that happened after that time, during the time of the Dark Ages and coming into the time of the Enlightenment and so on. So the historicist view is that it does have a focus in the Roman Empire, but it stretches out into the time of history, even into modern times. But that for us, 98% of it has already happened. But we can look back through all of history, from modern history all the way back to biblical times, and find all of those places where it points in along the way for the fulfillment of the book of Revelation. There again, except for the very last parts. So you have the preterist that wants to pretty much say, oh, it's all about the Romans. Okay, very early on, let me get my hands here. It's all about the Romans. Very early on, and that's the preterist view. The historicist view says, no, it's about the Romans, but it goes much broader than that. okay, that it would come up even into modern times, except for the very, very end. So the preterist is a shorter view, a smaller view. The historicist is a broader view, okay? So now with both of those sort of under our belt, we could look at the book of Revelation and go, oh, well, there's where this happened and so on. We could find perhaps we could find correlations in history to the points that the book of Revelation is trying to make, which makes for a really interesting exercise. And there have been some fabulous books written on both standpoints over the centuries. Even just in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a couple of really, really good books that explain those really, really well. And when you sit and you read a preterist commentary and you go, oh, so that was that, and that was that, and it was this emperor, and it was at that particular time, and so on, it makes a whole lot of sense. But then when you read the historicist, you go, but that makes a lot of sense too. Why is it that this squirrely book that we know as the book of Revelation has the ability to be applied over multiple periods of time? Let's think about that for just 1 second, and we'll pop another term up here for you. Okay, so this version is known as the futurist version, okay? Now, this is what's known, quote unquote, as the scary version, okay? The scary version is that we as readers in modern times, in the times in which we live, that while there are connections in our past to Roman history and biblical times because of when the book is written in the late 1st century. However, it's almost as though then it's like it's written, there are certain things that occur during the life of the author and then the people of the church during that time period. And then it stops. And then much later in time, it pops up and begins again. In other words, the primary view of the futurist is this: most of the book has not happened yet. This is what stirs movies about the Antichrist and movies about the apocalypse, movies about the end of the world, and so on. This is the idea that when these events begin to take place, they're going to begin to take place now. So that when the beast rises from the sea, quote unquote, of politics, when the drag, all of these different ideas, that all these things are yet to come. There was a series of books, a series of novels written some years ago called the Left Behind series. They're very entertaining, and they contain every bit of this view of the book of Revelation, of how it is all yet to happen, that it's all in front of us. This is the version that gets used quite a bit in evangelical Christianity and in other circles to basically sort of stir the fact that, hey, we need to be paying attention to how we live and understanding that there is a judgment that's coming. And when that judgment comes, it will be coming at the hands of an angry and righteous God who has every right to do what he does. The futurist view is the scary version. Lots and lots and lots of books, lots of movies that have been written around this particular view that takes these very old ideas and puts them in very modern connotations. So when you're doing your reading, excuse me, my eyes itching. When you're doing your reading for this unit, particularly when you're reading about the bowls and the trumpets and the seals that are being broken and so on, the judgments and the horrible things that are happening on the earth, and they are horrible things that are happening on the earth that you're going to be reading about, are still in front of us. That's the scary version. Okay? So when you're reading, this is the one that sometimes it's easiest to fall into because it doesn't require as much investigation as much as it does just imagination. Okay? So the futurist view is the scary version, that all of these things are still in front of us. And maybe perhaps it's something to consider. If prophetic literature, like Biddle talks about in his article, is something to teach us lessons and to keep our eyes open and to make sure that we're adjusting our lives accordingly, if we take the book of Revelation from that standpoint, we've got some lessons that need to be learned. Okay? Now, the last one, we pop this one out, pop this one in. This is the one that perhaps, though, makes the most sense. That it's all, the entire book, is symbolic. Now, I don't mean symbolic in the fact that it doesn't mean anything. I mean symbolic in the sense that all of the things that are used inside of it, the metaphors, the symbols, all of the signs, and all the different types of communications inside of it are visionary symbols that it deals with this universal cataclysm, the conflict between good and evil, and so on. And that basically is its purpose, is to get us to focus on the overall, the big questions, the grand questions, not just the little small individual events where people try to nail it down. It's dealing with much bigger things. It really is the universal battle between good and evil, and so on. Now, and there are a lot of people think this is where the Book of Revelation falls into, that it falls into the symbolic category. But truth be told, having read all having read all four views, and having spent some time doing that, and doing some intensive study in the Book of Revelation, the Book of Revelation is just squirrely. I mean, it has some really intense symbols in it, and some really intense ideas about persecution and so on. What an interesting fact. There have been more quote unquote Christian martyrs in the last 120 years than there were ever in the 1900 years before that. So if the book of Revelation is a futurist view and it's about persecution, then there's been far more persecution in the last 100 years than there was in almost 2 millennia before that. If that's the case, then this book is meant to be a message of encouragement in a time in which persecution is going to increase. Like I said, the futurist version is the scary version for the church and for the world, truth be told. So when we look at these four schools then of interpretation, we look at widely varying ideas, right? Where one is, it's focused particularly just on the Roman Empire, then the broader scope of history between the Romans up to our time period, then the future and going forward, way, 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 way forward from where we are now to these horrific and terrible events that are about to take place, or the fact that we're dealing with cosmic symbols, and so on. Now, just to sort of give you an idea then, and sort of break it down just a little bit, to give you an idea, okay? You're actually going to be reading a couple of chapters. You're going to be reading chapter 12 and chapter 13. Chapter 12 and 13, to me, are some of the most vivid images in the entire book. And that's why I put those in there for you to read. But there's language that we're not used to dealing with. And we talked a little bit about earlier on, when we talked about the wise men in the Christmas unit. We talked about the wise men coming and so on, and them being astronomers, but being familiar with astrology, and so on. Chapter 12 is rife with astrological images. When it talks about the woman clothed in the sun with the moon at her feet, and so on, and the dragon, those are astrological images that can actually be forecast to very particular dates. So understand, some of the symbols that you're reading, they're not just cosmic, wow, blow my mind symbols. They're attached to astrology of the ancient world. Okay. So you can actually, if you really wanted to, do some research about those astrological images, the woman clothed in the sun and so on. This is the constellation Virgo, at particular movements of the sun and moon at particular times of the years, with the crown upon her head, with the 7 stars and all this kind of thing. There's some really interesting astrological interpretations. We don't think in astrology these days, but astrology was very much a part of the ancient world. So for the audience that it was being written to, they would understand that. Chapter 13 and its great visions of the beast and the dragons and the crowns and the horns and the heads and all those types of things are political images. They're political images. So why would somebody refer to somebody in charge as the great beast and not use their name? Well, it's to keep you from getting your head chopped off, to be perfectly frank. You couldn't talk about the emperor at certain days and times. It was considered sedition. You could be put to death for it. So you had to deal in images. You had to talk in metaphors. But people you were talking to understood who you were talking about. So this whole idea then, so understand, Whereas chapter 12 is about astrology and particular events at particular times. Most people interpret it actually as being the first part of chapter 12 is actually about the birth of Jesus. The woman clothed in the sun and soul is symbolic of Mary. The child being born is Jesus. The great red dragon in that particular point is actually King Herod the Great, who wants to kill the child. We read that earlier on, but it's expressed in astrological terms. Chapter 13, before it's over with, and that's what I opened up with, those first little verses of the beast and so on. Chapter 13 is about political ideas of idolatry. Remember how heinous idolatry is considered to the Jewish people, particularly where something sets itself up to be worshipped instead of God. Chapter 13 is all about that the beast that rises, the dragon and so on, that they demand to be worshipped as God. Sounds like Domitian, right? So this whole idea then, this aspect of what deserves to be worshipped in our lives, whether it's God or if it's man and man's achievements. If this God has the right and has the ability to pour out all of this devastation and all these judgments upon the earth and mankind, the unbelievers, quote unquote, and the death of believers. I mean, there's a lot of people who die in the book of Revelation, a lot of believers who die, and a lot of people who don't believe who die. So it is a book of death and destruction and horrible images and disaster upon disaster. I mean, a third of the world's water is turned to blood, and a third of the vegetation dies, and this happens, and this happens. It seems this never-ending assault on the earth. But it's for the sake of wrapping up the grand scheme of good versus evil, and of course, God wins. That's the basic image. That's the basic idea, is that through all of these things, that evil is finally overcome, that the cause and the purpose behind evil is finally unraveled, and ultimate punishment is handed down, and then things begin fresh and anew in a new kingdom and a new world and a new earth and a new heaven and a new Jerusalem and all the beautiful ideas that go along with that. So I would encourage you as you're reading, don't get too strung out on one particular image. Let the book speak to you as you're reading. Like I said, you're not answering any particular questions. You're just doing study notes on these passages, but let it speak to you. Let your mind chase those little images around a little bit when you see the woman about to give birth with the dragon waiting to destroy the child. Let your mind sort of float back. Well, have I read anything like that? Well, sure, the Christmas story. Let it speak to you. Think about the way the world works. Think about politics and the way politics works, and people who are talking heads, and people who are just people who are there to say yes, 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 listen to this person, listen to this person, listen to this person. It's interesting in these days when we have people who have so much quote unquote influence, who have millions upon millions of followers, and then you look at some of these passages and you go, wow, that's kind of disturbing actually, where this person persuades all of these people to follow in the path of this person who really is a horrible, evil person. So understand, the symbols, though they're slippery and they're hard to nail down chronologically, may actually really still do apply in our world today. So look at the images, read and see how the seals, as the seals are broken and the trumpets are blown and the bowl judgments are poured out upon the earth and so on. I mean, just let it sort of overwhelm you, because, and understand this, and this is why I sort of kept this to the last, for a long time, and even in a lot of circles, sometimes even today, the book of Revelation was not permitted for casual reading for most believers. It was actually sort of held back and was not put into the hands of just anybody, because the process of understanding it is rather in depth, and the language is in depth. And it also has a horrible history of being misinterpreted and people getting hurt because of it. So Revelation has always been considered to be a very dangerous book for a lot of different reasons. Okay, now, so you can read the articles, you can read the passages, you'll experience it for yourself, because remember, that's what we're all about: reading the Bible for yourself and experiencing it for yourself, and let yourself chase around it. Now, So I said in the email I sent out there'd be a couple of hints about the final, because these are your last assignments. I'm recording on Tuesday the 14th. These assignments that you have posted for this week are not due until the 23rd, which is next Thursday. So you've got 10 days on these last couple of assignments to do all of these study notes on the Revelation passages as well as the articles attached to this particular passage. The articles are interesting. Biddle's article being about sort of how to put your mind in gear to deal with some of these quote-unquote prophetic ideas. The articles in the textbook, I love the one about the Goth reading, because the Goth reading of the text literally says we're taking this seriously, and we're expressing on the outside what we believe is an internal reality. It's a really interesting aspect. I bet it's something you never thought about with regard to the Goth movement. I think most of you have probably moved beyond that now. I think it's something that sort of has begun to slide into the past. And then the article about the literal reading of Revelation. If you pay attention in that article, that author has a hard time maintaining his thesis of reading it literally, because even he comes to the point that although you may want to read it literally, you're reading metaphors and you're reading symbols, and how do you interpret those literally? It's a struggle. So as you're doing your study notes, then, so as I was talking about, a couple of hints for the exam. One part of the exam is going to be simply a question about how to interpret a section of the book of Revelation. I'm not going to tell you what section it's going to be. It would be one that you've read, that you've already looked at, or at least will be close to that. And it will just simply be a sort of an idea of all the things that you've learned this semester and all the things that you've done this semester about learning to analyze a passage and really sort of breaking it down and looking into various ideas and letting it run around and squirrel around in your brain for a little while to sort of see what comes out of it. And most of you have just done some fabulous, fabulous work this semester with just sort of becoming more and more sensitive to what a text actually says. Instead of just reading it, that you're actually looking at it and trying to wrestle with it. And so part of the exam will be that you're going to wrestle, quote unquote, with a passage out of the book of Revelation or something similar to that anyway. The other half of the exam is sort of a standard kind of thing. So basically the exam will be 2 questions. It'll be 2 writing assignments. I probably will open the first one up, actually probably first of next week for those of you who want to get ahead on it. But basically it's just going to be 2 essay questions, which normally would be what you would do in class anyway. And so they're sort of your ideas to sort of gear you up for what's coming, okay? I promise you they will not be difficult, and you'll get through them no problem. I just want to say how proud I am that you guys have done so well through all this mess as we've been out since the 12th of March. Was the last time we saw each other, and how just you've struggled through and you've done the work, and I just appreciate that so much. And believe me, I'm taking all that into account when it comes to grading and so on. So remember, you do have the right, after final grades are posted, that you can contact the registrar and have it changed to a pass-fail. I don't think any of you are going to need that in my class, but you do have that option. That way classes don't affect your GPA if you had a hard time because of being at home. But do keep that in mind. Also, of course, we hope and pray that things are going to get back to normal, and we'll be back on campus in the fall. So we'll wrap up this lecture about Revelation, and we hope that you guys will be well. Take care of yourself. Any questions, any problems, of course, just email me as always, and we will hopefully be able to finish up on a good note and be able to wrap up the semester with this final assignments. Okay, have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.